Hello and welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, doing a solo episode today. Going to go over the snap shares as usual after week 4, do a review of what we saw this week, what it means moving forward, trade targets, waiver wire, a lot of injuries this week, so we got a lot to go over. We are also still trying to hit that sub goal of 1,000, so if you're new here, hit that subscribe button for us. First guy we're going to talk about is the obvious name from this week, and it was Woody Marks. So he kind of took over as the number one running back on the Houston offense. We had kind of seen this trend building over the first month. He was on our waiver wire column last week. We talked about him in the snap share last week, how he had taken over the third down role from Dario Gumbawale, how only two of these guys, Chubb and Marks, were touching the ball last week. So I know Matt added him in our league, so he's got to be very excited about this. This is going to be the number one waiver claim of the week. You see 17 carries for 69 yards. Next guy I want to talk about, missed the first 3 games for a different reason, suspension related, not injury related, is Jordan Addison. So you might see his 4 receptions and maybe think he had a limited role, but he didn't. Immediately stepped in as the number 2 wide receiver. He has 3 snaps and 52 routes run, pretty much right in line with Justin Jefferson. And so this was an excellent thing to see right out of the gate. He had this long 81-yard play, busted coverage down the right sideline. He got tackled on the 1-yard line, got caught by a linebacker. So I don't know that that's very indicative of who he is as an explosive player. I think he had to wait for the ball, and so he didn't quite get back up to full speed enough to pull away. But overall, I think that he's probably going to be awesome moving forward. Now, is he as good as Godwin? Is he as good as Diggs? I don't necessarily think so at this point. So maybe throw a low ball offer at him, try and get him on get him on your bench in certain leagues. And then maybe if you can add him to one of your players and move up, do a 2-for-1 where you get a better player if somebody's struggling with injuries or bye weeks this week, and you offer Addison as a second piece. I think that could be an interesting type of trades. I think he'll be good, but he's going to have some boom weeks and he's going to have some duds. So overall, I like Addison. I think if you have him, you can hold tight. If you like having boom bust type of players in your lineups, decent flex if you need some upside. So I think Addison overall, it was great to see him out there for so many snaps right away. So definitely wheels up here for Minnesota. The next team we're going to talk about here is a very unfortunate situation. Obviously, Malik Neighbors torn ACL. He's out for the year. So there's going to be a little bit of review here on what ended up happening with the Giants receiving core after he left. So Neighbors had been playing predominantly with Darius Slayton in 2 wide receiver sets, and then Slayton wasn't playing in 3 wide receiver sets. That was Wandale was coming on the field with Hyatt or with Bo Collins in 3 wide receiver sets, and that changed completely because Wandale was the one who took over in 2 wide receiver sets now. And so you see it reflected in the snap share here where he had 74 snaps, led the team in routes run, led the team in targets. And so, I think that there might be a situation here for Wandale to be a solid buy low. If he's still out on your waiver wires, you definitely want to make sure you grab Wandale Robinson this week. And if you can get him thrown in as a second piece to a trade type of thing, or if you can throw a low ball trade and somebody will give him up for hardly anything, because he did have 3 for 14, not like he is going to be a world beater or anything, but I do think the role is going to be such that he should probably be the number 1 on this team. Now, we've seen Slayton in similar or when Neighbors was hurt last year, actually have 2 very productive games. We'll see how Jackson Dart does throwing the ball. That's the other part of the equation here. He didn't throw the ball a lot this week, so you see only 20 targets for the whole team. But if he's forced to throw 30 times or they get down, we might see Slayton work down the field, middle of the field a little bit more. And Wandale, he flashed a little bit that he was a little bit more downfield with Wilson. Now, is that going to be the case, or is it going to go back to a 3 or 4 yard ADOT? We don't know any of that at this point, but we do know that Wandale went from playing in only 3 wide receiver sets to playing in 2 wide receiver sets and being a full-time receiver. So I think the role is important to chase here, and I think Wandale's role is going to be the one that expands the most. Next guy, I just got to mention Kenneth Gainwell. I saw a lot of Caleb Johnson propaganda when Jalen Warren was out. Now, I left Jalen Warren in 2 of my lineups. I did not expect him to miss the game, but I was reading through, in the first quarter. And so I obviously would have started Kenneth Gainwell. I mean, I own him on a team where I have Jalen Warren. And so Gainwell obviously handsomely rewarded anybody who started him, 99 yards and 2 touchdowns, and also had 6 catches for 35 yards. So I'm almost more encouraged for Warren. I mean, if Warren had been playing, I would have expected him to perform relatively similarly. He had taken over most of the work. And so maybe this turns it back into more of a split because of how good Gainwell was, but I'm not sure that that's going to be the case. I think mainly this shows that Gainwell can play well in replacement of Warren. And so if you have Warren and you want to cuff with Gainwell, I think that's a really smart move. And now moving forward, we know who to play. It's not Caleb Johnson, it's Kenneth Gainwell. So overall, just wanted to mention that he dominated snaps, he dominated routes run, he dominated carries, he dominated targets. It was all Kenneth Gainwell all game, and he was awesome against a good Minnesota defense. Next team we're going to go over here is the New Orleans Saints receiving corps. So this was a little bit surprising for me to see, because if you just look at the box score, you see Shaheed 4 for 47, and he actually had a couple carries as well. So you probably think, oh, he was doing great in his usual role, but that wasn't exactly the case. Brandon Cooks actually took over for him in 2 wide receiver sets. So Brandon Cooks ran the most routes and he played the most snaps. And so if Cooks is going to take over Shaheed's role, I think this is an interesting time to try and either get off of Shaheed, like trade him for sure. And I think it makes Brandon Cooks an interesting waiver wire claim, because if he's going to be the one out there in these games, if they're going to rack up 40 plus pass attempts, I think Brandon Cooks's production can significantly outperform what we saw here, the 3 for 22. Now, they do run a lot of 3 wide receiver sets, because you see Shaheed still out there on 47 snaps, still ran 28 routes. So his role didn't completely evaporate, but I am concerned that they were rotating a little bit. If Vele gets involved at all, even a little bit more, because they did use a 4th round pick to trade for him, so it doesn't seem reasonable to not use him. I'm worried now that might come at the expense of Shaheed instead of Brandon Cooks, who's playing in those 2 wide receiver sets. So just keep your eyes open to it. Brandon Cooks, I think, is a decent waiver wire claim in super deep leagues. I'm sure he's out there in a ton of leagues. He only owned 2% of sleeper leagues, so definitely somebody or a situation that you want to start monitoring, because this was new this week. It had been Shaheed and 2 wide receiver sets until this week. Sticking with the Saints, we wanted to go over the running backs a little bit, just because Kendre Miller did get a little bit more involved than normal this week. He had an awesome 18-yard touchdown run, shook a defender, and was able to get in. And, he's super young still, and the last coaching staff didn't like him very much, but it seems like he's been in the good graces of Kellen Moore and this coaching staff. So showing a little explosion, and he still didn't play nearly as many snaps as Kamara, completely uninvolved in the passing game. That's never going to be his role, but having somebody to mix in on rushing downs, I think, is at least a little bit interesting for Kamara, who, there's been some trade rumors around him. So maybe you cuff Kamara with Kendre and hope that Kamara gets traded, and then you get 2 starting running backs, or you just have somebody who could grow into somebody that could be a decent flex if he gets a more and more stable role in the rushing game, if he's going to get double-digit carries moving forward. Not the greatest thing to rely on, but at least somebody, again, probably in deeper leagues, that you can throw on your bench. And if you have Kamara, it's good to see that he's out there a lot, because it's pretty clear that he's going to be the hand. Next guy we're going to talk about or focus on here from Tennessee is Calvin Ridley. I advised last week to get off of Calvin Ridley if you could and try and add Alec Ayomanor. And obviously the Tennessee passing game has just been a complete nightmare through the first month of the season. If you guys saw the Cam Ward quote, right, he said, "If I keep it a buck, we ask." So they're just not very good, unfortunately. But this is a 5-alarm fire for me with Calvin Ridley. If you can get anything for him in trade, you absolutely should be doing it. And I'm not above just outright cutting him. I just don't think that there's a huge role, or just the offense overall is bad. And if there's not going to be a huge role for him, he's not going to be the focal point of the passing offense. I think it's totally fine to move on. Alec Ayomanor seems to be taking over as the number 1, and that trend was something that we saw even last week. So we're definitely going to be talking about this again next week. We're going to be looking over this. But yeah, Calvin Ridley, somebody that you've got to trade this week if somebody hasn't flagged that his role is diminishing. Going over to Carolina now, looking at their running backs. Let's look at Rico Dowdle, who actually is playing a lot more than I would have ever expected. I definitely expected Chuba to just stay in the workhorse role, but now we're seeing him split almost evenly with Dowdle in terms of snaps. And honestly touches too, or opportunities 13-10. And so Rico Dowdle, somebody that I think, isn't going to be great, but somebody again in deep leagues that could be added this week, get ahead of the waiver wire on him, or, just keep an eye on for Chuba, somebody that is definitely another trade candidate. If you can trade Chuba away for anything decent, or add him to a deal where you can trade up at wide receiver maybe or something like that, definitely start doing that for Chuba. Not somebody that I'm looking at as as a running back too for very much longer. If he's going to continue to get snaps and work taken away by Dowdle, you'll see Trevor Etienne in there, and he played in garbage time. This game got out of hand, and so he just got his 7 carries at the very end of the game. So don't read into that. This was Hubbard and Dowdle until that point in the game. Looking into Cleveland now, Cedric Tillman got hurt, unfortunately, hamstring injury. So you see he only played 15 snaps, and who stepped in as the number 2? Well, it was Isaiah Bond. And this was somebody I talked about last week as well, who started to mix in on 2 wide receiver sets, which was something that was obviously unexpected, but is kind of understandable based on his talent. We see him lead the team in receiving this week, even though Joe Flacco was absolutely abysmal. Last guy I want to review here is Zach Ertz. So we saw his snaps decline quite a bit here, right? 35-27 for Ben Sinnott. They've talked about trying to keep him fresh as the season goes along, because he does turn 35 this season. But unfortunately, by doing that, it kind of reduces the role that I think he can be productive in. So you see the 2 for 21, you see the reduced snap shares. It's declined since over the last couple of weeks, which I think was just part of their plan. But unfortunately, I think that makes him mostly unusable in fantasy. And so if you've been rolling with Ertz, or you added him thinking you could get some production, I just don't think that's going to be the case. And he's very touchdown or bust here. So hopefully we see Terry McLaurin return in the next couple of weeks. Jaden Daniels should be back. But overall, I'd rather have Brenton Strange. There's a lot of tight ends too, I think, that are out there that I'd rather take a shot on than Ertz at this point with the declining snap share role. All right, so let's get into the waiver wire now. I'm going to try and make this super quick. At quarterback, Superflex obviously is what we look at here from that perspective. Dylan Gabriel is somebody that I think should get onto your radar now. If you have quarterback constraint limits, maybe you can't add him quite yet, but if you don't, or you can carry a 4th quarterback, I think you should probably do that. Joe Flacco was terrible this week. They're 1-3. They had that lucky win against the Packers. I still can't believe they beat the Packers, but they get a couple more difficult opponents. And if they're looking at 1-5, 1-6, they play the Dolphins in week 7. I think that could be the game where Gabriel gets to start. So I think he's the next rookie that's going to take a step into the starting lineup. And so getting ahead of that, he's got some decent weapons and a decent running game. So, ideally he'd be able to be relatively productive as the starter there. At running back, we talked about Woody Marks, obviously the number 1 claim of the week. About 30% of your budget is what I would expect that he goes for. Now, depending on how badly you need a player, a running back specifically, you could go higher than that. You could stick at 30, or, you know your league. Maybe they're not going to spend so much, maybe you can get away with 18 or 22, something like that. But I do think that this is the next prize in the running back market for sure. I kind of think he might be better than Scatterbo rest of the season if Mixon doesn't come back. So there's obviously that caveat in there. But overall, I think Woody Marks is a really good player. Rachaad White, he's on here just because Bucky Irving went for an MRI today. So definitely look at Rachaad White if you're the Bucky Irving owner, but also if you need bench depth, just try and get him on your team. He got double-digit touches this week. He's still pretty involved in the offense, and even as good as Bucky is, he's somebody that can be decent. And if Bucky misses time, somebody that's going to be locked into starting lineups. Kenneth Gainwell, we already talked about him. Great handcuff to Jaylen Warren, and ideally can kind of carve out a little bit of a role for himself if you guys need him in a pinch for flex. Kendra Miller, we talked about him as well. Enrico Dowdle, we talked about him as well. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on those guys, both pretty low owned players. Number one wide receiver for this week, Romeo Doubs, just scored 3 touchdowns. Hard not to have him top the list here. Only 45% rostered in sleeper leagues. I was actually pretty shocked to see that. So I expect that to get up into the 60s this week. And then the New York guys, we talked about them quite a bit earlier. So Wandale and then Slayton for me in that order. Wandale is 64% rostered. So the chance that he's available is pretty low. Slayton's only 5%. I still think Slayton's a great add. Malik Washington makes it on here. Unfortunate knee injury for Tyreek Hill. Very, very difficult to watch that play. But from a fantasy football fallout perspective, I think, Malik Washington and you see Darren Waller over in the tight ends make this list because we don't know exactly where his targets are going to go. And the pass offense had been pretty concentrated in Tyreek Hill. He was definitely the top option. So those targets are going to have to go somewhere. This last game, they did end up beating the Jets. A little bit weird from a passing game perspective because Waller got 2 touchdowns, but not a ton of volume. And then Waddle didn't really do anything, and they barely threw it to HN. So moving forward, just add these guys and see what happens. Brandon Cooks, we talked about. Isaiah Bond, we talked about. The last guy that we didn't talk about here was AD Mitchell. He was so close to having a monster game. I mean, the fact that he fumbled on the half-yard line going in on what would have been a 70-plus yard touchdown was just so unfortunate. But I put him on here, deep league guy, specifically because Alec Pierce is out. And as long as he's out, AD Mitchell is going to be somebody that I think can be productive, especially with as good as Daniel Jones has been playing. So, he was out there for 89% of the snaps this week, which is a huge change in role for him, but fueled by injury, obviously. So if you got a spot for him in a deep league, I think AD Mitchell is worth throwing a dollar at. Darren Waller, talked about him, fallout from Tyreek Hill. It's his first game. Kind of showed a little juice that he's got something left in the tank. He scored twice. So at the very least, he'll be a red zone threat. We saw Jonnu Smith come on last year and be a huge red zone threat over the second half of the season, really. So if Darren Waller is going to be filling any sort of red zone role, especially with Tyreek Hill out now, you could do worse at tight end, I think. And then Brenton Strange, back-to-back games with 7 targets. He's been pretty steady to start the year. Nothing flashy, hasn't scored, but overall, if you have Zach Ertz, I'd rather have Strange type of thing, and David Njoku even is kind of getting there. If you have Njoku, I think I'd rather have Strange at this point. So, you could do worse than Strange. And then Mason Taylor just had a pretty good game, 7 targets, 5 for 65, kind of filled that number 2 role in the passing game for the Jets this week, which is something that I was concerned about coming into the year. I'm thinking it might be Breece Hall, but after this week, not saying it's going to be Mason Taylor, but a rookie a month into the season having a good performance is noteworthy. So somebody that Matt and I both liked coming into the year. And if again, deep league or you just need somebody at tight end, I think he might be good to throw a dollar at in a deep league. All right. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. Look forward to talking to you in the next one.